Today I'm going to talk about the first clash between British and German fleets during the First World War. At the time, the Royal Navy had 60% more capital ships than Germany. This gave them a large advantage, but it was less of an advantage than it would have been in 1909. Before 1909, they had kept a fleet that was twice as large as the next two fleets combined. This proved too expensive to maintain, even for the richest empire in the world. It was so expensive that Britain decided to share the burden of policing the seas with its old enemy, the French, under the Anglo-French Naval Agreement of 1912. The Royal Navy undertook the Channel coast and the French would police the Mediterranean. If war came, Britain could use the time-tested strategy of blockade. However, changes in technology since Nelson's day meant that it was no longer possible to keep a fleet just outside the enemy's ports. Instead, the battleships of the Grand Fleet would stay up north in Scottish waters while cruisers and destroyers patrolled the line midway through the North Sea between Britain and Germany. Officers of the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow spent most of their time battling boredom rather than the Germans. As one said, "We had some fun at the Heligoland show, and since then they've made themselves rather scarce." By the Heligoland show, they meant the Battle of Heligoland, which took place near the heavily defended island that protected the Jade Estuary. Heligoland had actually been a British island for most of the 19th century, and the German desire to get their hands on it had been one of the worst kept secrets in international diplomacy. The British offered to exchange it for Zanzibar, and adding that island to their own sphere of influence. The Germans took the deal and then spent 2 decades building it into a fortress that formed the cornerstone of their defensive strategy. The German Admiralty believed that their task was to keep Heligoland Bight clear of British submarines and mines so that they would not find themselves blocked in. They understood the dangers of blockade, just as the British did. As Beatty pointed out, the most important factor in the upcoming war would be whether Britain could blockade Germany to its knees or whether Germany did the same to them. Every morning, German light cruisers escorted destroyers to a point 20 miles northwest of Heligoland. From there, they fanned out to patrol the North Sea for British submarines and mine layers. The British plan was to use 3 submarines to lure the destroyers further out to sea. This would let 2 British destroyer flotillas, commanded by Reginald Truett, slip behind them and cut them off to stop them from getting back under the cover of the guns of Heligoland. During the night of the 27th of August, Commodore Keyes escorted the submarines in, while the rest of the flotilla got into position. The Royal Navy deployed 8 submarines and 56 ships for this operation. One of these was HMS Hind. It would be a long day for the stokers on board her. They had been trying to sleep, laying close to their action stations with just a pair of boots for a pillow. The boiler room hatch was only a few yards away in case they were called to action stations. They only had a few minutes to look up at the dark dome of the sky before starting their shift, feeding coal into the insatiable furnaces down below in the boiler room. As dawn broke on the 28th of August, Truett saw the blurred shapes of 3 4-funneled cruisers steaming towards him. He'd no time to retreat. He just crossed his fingers and flashed a recognition signal. He must have been very relieved when they replied. They said that they were part of Commodore Goodenough's cruiser squadron and there to support him. First contact with the enemy was at 7 a.m. HMS Arethusa saw the German destroyer G194 3 miles ahead to her port bow. The German ship immediately turned and ran to the south for the safety of Helgoland. Officers shouted down voice pipes to the engine rooms and the British destroyers gave chase. They accelerated until they were throwing up high bow waves as they cut through the sea. Down below, stokers felt the boilers vibrating with terrific high pressure. Every man knew that if a shell put the 4 draft fans out of action, they would be reduced to cinders by the backflash coming from their white-hot furnaces. But they kept shoveling coal until they burned even hotter. As the 4 British destroyers chased their prey, it was calling out for help over the wireless. Hipper received these messages and assumed that his destroyers were being attacked by British destroyers, so he ordered the German light cruisers Stettin and Fraulob to hunt for them down. As they were chasing G194, the British spotted V1 and opened fire. Then they spotted a D8. A British shell hit her bridge, killing her captain. more shells hit T-33. G9 signalled to the gunners on Heligoland that they needed help. But as the mist was too thick, it was impossible for the artillerymen to tell friend from foe, and they held their fire. At 7:58, Frauenlob and Stettin arrived. Now the hunters had become the hunted. The British destroyers broke off their pursuit and raced back towards Arethusa and Fearless. Trewhitt had been following the sound of the battle. For the first time that day, the light cruisers engaged. So many British shells hit the sea near Stettin that it looked as if the ship was sailing through boiling water. On paper, Arethusa should have been the superior ship, but she'd only recently been commissioned and her inexperience soon started to tell. 2 of her 4-inch guns jammed and a third was destroyed by a German shell. Frauenlob's fire, on the other hand, was remarkably accurate. Within 10 minutes, Arethusa was hit 35 times. 12 of the crew were killed, including the young flag lieutenant, who had been standing close to his commodore. The ship's cook, who had been in the galley preparing breakfast, had one of his arms shot away. He saw an empty cigarette tin, grabbed it and slammed it onto the bloody stump that remained. This sealed the wound and stopped him from bleeding to death. Arethusa's decks were soon thick with shell fragments. Her bridge and upper works were covered in so many holes that you could have used them for a nutmeg grater. One of her one remaining gun hit Frauenlob 10 times. One of these shells struck the bridge, killing or wounding 37 men, including the captain. This forced the German ship to break away and head for the protection of Heligoland. At 8:12, with the Germans withdrawing and Heligoland close at hand, Trewhitt signalled his force to reform and sweep to the west. They crossed paths with 6 German destroyers returning to Heligoland. 5 of them managed to slip away into the mist. But they were not the only things lurking there. Keyes, supervising his submarines from HMS Lurcher, saw the shadowy shapes in the haze and sent out a message saying that he was in contact with enemy cruisers. Trewhitt, hearing Keyes' message, tried to help his friend by signalling good enough, not realising that it was good enough's own squadron that they had both seen. While this was going on, Trewhitt's forces opened fire on the one remaining German destroyer, V-187. The German was going at full speed and it looked like they were going to get away. But then, suddenly, it spun around and headed straight back at them. The German destroyer had seen the outline of Goodenough's light cruisers and decided to take his chances with the destroyers instead. She sped past the first line of British destroyers. For a moment, it looked like the plan was going to work. Then she was stopped by the second line. She was surrounded and pummeled at point-blank range until she stopped firing. The British ships lowered boats to try and rescue the survivors. The Germans, however, thought that they were boarding parties coming to take their ship as a prize. One officer took out his gun and fired at the British destroyer HMS Goshawk 200 yards away. He hit her wardroom and restarted the battle. V-187 fought until the bitter end and sank with her colours still flying. Now it really was a rescue. The boats rowed out to try and pick up as many German sailors as they could from the wreck. But as they did, Stettin appeared. Some of the destroyers managed to get their boat crews back on board, along with their prisoners, but none of them had time to collect their boats. HMS Defender didn't even have time to collect her men. This forced her to leave her boats behind with 1 British officer, 9 sailors and 28 German prisoners still on them. This must have felt very alone in the middle of the grey wasteland of the North Sea as their destroyer steamed away. What they didn't know was there was something else watching from beneath the waves. 20 minutes later, a submarine emerged. There was not enough space on board for everyone, so they took the British sailors as well as a sample of the Germans, the Commodore, a petty officer and a sailor. The remaining Germans were given ship's biscuits and a compass, and as well as the course that they needed to follow to reach Heligoland, 14 miles away. The submarine's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Ernest W. Lear, would be mentioned in dispatches for his part in the rescue. While this was going on, other submarines were attacking the destroyers. The situation became so confused that British submarines almost ended up attacking British ships. But returned to Arethusa. Just as she was restarting her engines, 3 German light cruisers appeared. Strasbourg appeared first and opened fire. Salvo after salvo fell, but luckily for the British ship, they all landed 20 to 30 yards short. Not a single shell hit her. Truitt mistook Helgoland for the powerful Root-class armoured cruiser and sent out a signal asking for help. Goodenough sped to his aid, along with his entire squadron. Before he could get there, Helgoland had slipped back into the mist, as her captain did not want to face the mass torpedo tubes of the British destroyers. At 11:30, the British destroyers were steaming west, ahead of Arethusa and sighted Mainz. Both sides opened fire, but Mainz had a better aim and frequently straddled the destroyers. HMS Laurel was hit 3 times. Laurel's commander, Frank F. Rose, was wounded in both legs, but remained on the bridge. Just behind her, commanding officer of HMS Liberty had a leg shot off. He was still giving orders, clinging to the bridge rail, when a shell took his head off. Chief Petty Officer James Beadle had been on the wheel, listening for orders. He was wounded in the kidneys, but remained at his post. Down below, Petty Officer John Galvin was up to his chest in water as he tried to stop all the leaks. Lysander, the 3rd destroyer in the line, was not hit, but HMS Lafroy was struck by 4 shells by a single German salvo. When the smoke cleared, her decks were running with blood. Chief Petty Officer Archibald Bishop had survived the battle and would later be awarded a Distinguished Service Medal for his part in it. All the British destroyers fired torpedoes until it looked like the sea was furrowed with the tracks of bubbling white water. The German light cruiser abruptly turned and ran. A torpedo from the British destroyer Lydiard hit her. The ship reared, bending perceptibly from end to end, and all of her emergency lights went out. Mainz turned west to get away from the destroyers, only to sail straight into the arms of Goodenough's cruisers, now only 6,000 yards away. They pummeled her with gunfire. Gun crews, communications ratings, ammunition and supply parties were all blown to pieces. The upper deck was a chaos of ruin, flame and scorching heat. Everything was streaked with yellow and green residue from explosives. The captain realised that he was not going to be able to save his ship. He ordered his men to put on life jackets and then stepped out from the conning tower and was immediately killed by a shell burst. At 12:25, Goodenough signalled ceasefire. At 12:50, he ordered the light cruiser Liverpool to lower boats so they could pick up men swimming in the water. Commodore Keyes tried to get HMS Lurcher right alongside the Mainz so that he could pick up the survivors. He managed to rescue 220 of her crew. In the end, there was only one young German officer standing on the deck. Keyes called out to him that he had done splendidly, but they must leave. The Commodore held out his hand to help the man jump aboard. The German officer drew himself up, saluted, and said thank you. No. A few minutes later, Mainz rolled over. She lay on her side for 10 minutes. Then she sank. By this point, Arethusa was in not much better condition. Most of her guns were out of action, and her gun crews lay dead or wounded on the upper deck. She had 36 shell holes in her side. It looked as if Arethusa had fought her first and last battle. Shells from Strasbourg and Cole were falling near her, and out of the mist, vast, shadowy shapes began to form. 5 huge ships roared past the crippled cruiser like an express train. These giants were the battle cruisers Lion, Queen Mary, Prince Elizabeth, Invincible, and New Zealand, under the command of Admiral Beatty. The men on the destroyers waved their caps and cheered themselves hoarse as the mighty battle cruisers steamed past. At 12:56, the battle cruisers opened fire. Strasbourg turned and fled, but Cologne was doomed. She tried to return fire with her little 4-inch guns, but in a few minutes she was a hulk. Alfred Neumann, a stoker on Cologne, described what it was like in the last few minutes before he went overboard. Bodies lay in heaps amongst a jumble of smashed boats and shell fragments. Each of the 3 funnels was riddled through with shells of an enormous diameter, and the bridge had simply disappeared. The German light cruisers had come rushing out to devour the British destroyers, only to themselves be devoured by a larger predator. A shot from Lion struck Ariadne's forward boiler room and put half her boilers out of action. Flames spread across her stern. She tried to fight back with her deck guns, but these little 4-inch weapons were as much use as a popgun against a monster like the Lion. Ariadne had no more chance than Mainz or Helgoland had before her. Fearing the presence of submarines and mines, Admiral Beatty decided there was time to leave. At 1:10 p.m., only 40 minutes after he arrived, Beatty turned Lion and her sisters to the northwest. He then made a general signal for all the British forces in the Bight to retire. The stokers on HMS Hind were given a well-earned meal of bully beef and bread, and at 2 p.m. they started back for England, escorting their damaged comrades at a mere 6 knots. This was not a moment too soon, as at 2:10 p.m. the German battlecruisers Moltke and von der Tann crossed the Jade Bar and headed out to sea. They arrived only 15 minutes later. Hipper had arrived in Seydlitz just in time to watch Ariadne roll over and sink with her colours still flying. Her remaining crew had mustered on the foredeck and sang Deutschland über alles before abandoning ship. They were all picked up and taken back to shore. The crew of the Colne were not so lucky. At that moment there were 250 men trying to stay afloat in the icy cold North Sea. The next day there were only 60 drifting among the corpses, held up by their life jackets. By the time that he was picked up, Alfred Neumann was the only one left. 79 men and 7 officers that HMS Liverpool had picked up from the Mainz were landed at Rosyth at 7:45 p.m. The rest of the prisoners were transferred to Cressy and Bacchante and taken to the Nore. Duncan Lorimer, a surgeon on board HMS Bacchante, was operating from 4:30 that evening through the night until 8 o'clock in the morning, as he tried to save as many men as possible. They had terrible wounds, full of dirt and fragments of metal, or crushed limbs where the bones had shattered and had to be amputated. HMS Amethyst was towing Laurel, and HMS Hogue did the same for Arethusa. When Arethusa came past Sheerness to dock at Chatham, the crowds gathered from every direction and cheers rose to the skies. As Lion and her sisters steamed down the lines of the anchored Grand Fleet battleships, sailors lined their decks and cheered. As she glided to a halt, her anchor chain jammed in the chocks, forcing her to go back and make a second approach. Beatty hadn't felt the cheering was deserved the first time round, so when they cheered him a second time, he was absolutely livid. The Admiralty, however, loved it. They ordered each ship engaged in the action to be given the battle honour, Heligoland, August 28, 1914. Unlike the later Battle of Jutland, there is no doubt that this was a British victory. The destroyer, V-187, and 3 German light cruisers, Mainz, Colne and Ariadne, had been sunk. 2 more light cruisers, Strasbourg and Stettin, were damaged. There had been over 1,200 German casualties and 336 taken prisoner. On the British side, the light cruiser Arethusa and 3 destroyers had been heavily damaged, with only 35 British killed and 40 wounded. Every man involved would receive a share of the prize money, and King George would receive their Heroes of Helgoland at Buckingham Palace to hand out commemorative medals. Captain Hall, who had been the captain of Queen Mary, was appointed Director of Intelligence Division at the Admiralty. He had already demonstrated his own intelligence while captain of Queen Mary, where he had reduced crime on board his ship to an unheard-of level by abolishing the ship's police. But the biggest effect of this action was on the Germans. They were horrified by the material losses, and they soon realised their fatal error was to assume that British light forces would attack in German waters without the support of heavy ships. They did not know that the battlecruisers had not been part of the original plan, but Jellicoe had sent them anyway. The Battle of Heligoland Bight confirmed the respect the High Seas Fleet had for the Royal Navy, and made the Kaiser more determined to restrict his fleet to a defensive strategy, as he did not want to lose any more of his beloved ships. But this does not mean that they were just going to rot in their harbours. The fleet would still go out to raid the British coast, and next time I'm going to talk about one of these raids and how the German Navy earned the name Baby Killers. If you'd like to hear that story, then please like and subscribe and tell the algorithm that you might want to see it. If not, then thank you for listening this long.